They called her just the help, and the word cut like winter wind. It slid from lips that never meant harm, but it had a way of settling into the small town like frost, sneaking into doorways, sitting heavy on window sills, leaving everything it touched a little harder to open. She moved through the morning like a woman with a map of other people's needs sewn into her hands. She wiped a counter, refilled a coffee pot, tied an apron that had seen better summers. The saloon was low-lit with lamplight and the smell of coffee that had been standing on the stove since dawn. Boots hit the floor in a steady rhythm, and the kettle on the back stove hissed like breath held too long. Outside, wagon wheels creaked as the town turned to life. Nobody noticed the way the dust clung to the hem of her skirt like a shadow. Her name wasn't a thing people spoke when they were being polite. That was the town's custom. Keep names for the important people, railroad men, bankers, preachers. Give titles instead to those who keep the town going. She answered to girl or help and sometimes to harsher words. All of them flung with the comfort of someone who had sat at that table long enough to forget where the line was. But she had a backbone that surprised them when they caught glimpse of it. She could carry a sack of flour up 2 flights of stairs without pausing. Calluses lived on her fingers, and her eyes were steady like a lantern that had weathered more nights than it had left. She pressed her lips shut for the most part. She had learned the usefulness of silence. It bought her time to act, to muffle her shame into work. Her name was Marin, though the town rarely used it. They thought of her as a fixture, a plain-spoken woman who moved through the saloon like a practiced line in a hymn. Necessary, unremarked upon, steady. She came to town before the first winter after her husband. The last letter she kept in a tin box had a smudge of mud on the corner and a promise that smelled of pipe smoke. He would come home by spring. That spring never came. He was a grave and a memory and a husband more present in ache than in voice. The loss had bent her into a different shape, not less but more difficult for people to fit into. There was an unspoken rule in that part of the prairie. A woman without a husband was a danger to the balance of things. Some said she should marry again or leave. Some said she had to laugh when everyone else laughed or else. They watched how she set plates out at the saloon and judged the way she carried herself like a ledger kept in her spine. On the first day we meet her, the town was getting ready for the cold. Folks stacked wood against porches, and children shifted from one foot to another, trying to remember the warmth of summer. Winds came thin and sharp from the north, carrying a smell of far-off snow. The saloon windows rattled. Marin drew a blanket tighter around her shoulders when she carried dishes to the back, though she kept her face even. The blanket had been patched a dozen times. Its thread told of nights spent warming the empty bed. She had been given that blanket 3 winters ago by an old woman passing through. The woman's hands had been shaking, and she had pressed the blanket into Marin's hands with a look that said, "There's no shame in being cold." But folks in the saloon had laughed and called it charity. Marin had smiled in a way that hid the twitch in her jaw. That winter came with a rumor. Horses were restless on the edges of town, and men talked in lower voices, like the wind might get the wrong idea. There had been more men with longer coats than usual. More conversations stopped when a sheriff walked through the door. The sheriff, Mr. Talbot, had a face like a coin worn thin by other people's hands. He loved the sound of being right. At his side, the town's self-appointed guardians, wives of prosperous men, shopkeepers, the preacher's oldest son, kept their tongues sharp. They polished their boots and their opinions alike. Then he rode into town, the kind of man who made strangers pause and measure their own gait against his. They called him Caleb Rowan before they knew his name. He had the sort of weathered face that told of years on the trail and a jaw that held secrets like the land held water. He kept to himself mostly, leaning on the bar in the late afternoons, watching like someone who read people the way some read the weather. He'd hitch his hat on the peg and cupped his hands around a tin mug as if it were a nest. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was with small, measured sentences, like coins placed carefully on a counter. She noticed him because he looked at her as people seldom did, without the quick assessment that checked whether she was useful or not. His eyes lingered like warm hands. He saw what her face said when she thought no one was watching. The tightness at the edges, the line where her courage met its own doubts. He saw years of holding herself steady for others. He saw the ways she moved to keep the world functioning. There was something about him, a history she could not read from his clothes, that settled beside her like a second shadow. The town, of course, did not approve of outsiders who were not eager to buy land and expect favors in return. They liked the predictable sort, sharp-dressed, silver-tongued, men who paid for favors with coin and told the story of their virtues to anyone who would listen. Caleb was different. He had a coat that had seen rain and had holes seamed with honest thread. There was dust in the seams of his boots, and his hands were the sort that told stories of hard work, not the kind that smoothed over wrongdoings with a banknote. The preacher's wife took offense at his refusal to pitch in with sermons about the town's shining virtues. The sheriff's wife whispered to friends that he might be trouble. He shrugged it off with a look that suggested he knew what people said about a man who kept his past quiet. Marin was used to being invisible. She was not used to being watched in a way that looked like care. She offered him coffee the first week he was in town, as she offered it to every traveler. Her hands were steady as she poured, and the coffee steamed in the tin cup like a small promise. He took it without fuss, as if it was natural for someone to set the cup before him and for someone else to answer when his jaw tightened. "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone," he told someone once without preamble, and the words slid across the room like an unexpected warmth. It was the first time someone had said anything like that about her loud enough to hear. Men turned their heads. The sheriff's laugh stuttered and fell flat, like a train that had hit a rut. She felt her cheeks prick, and she put the coffee pot down on the stove as if the true measure of the man had been poured into it and set aside. He began to leave small things where she would see them, an extra sack of flour by the door, a rag folded neatly on a peg. It was not charity. It was a kind of attendance. He watched the way she moved, and he nodded when she did the same for other people, when she offered a cloth to a child with a skinned knee or fixed a frayed strap for a wagon. He saw the way her smile was a thing that belonged to others even when it was her own. Then one day she did something that cost her more than a few coins. A traveling woman came through, a girl with a baby who had a fever and the sort of wildness you get from being on the road too long. The girl had been laughed at in the general store because her boots were ragged and her coin less so. She came to the saloon looking for a place to warm, and Marin saw the baby's skin like paper and the way the mother's hands shook as if the cold had got inside them. Without a word, Marin took the woman on the back stairs. She gave the mother the blankets from beneath the counter and boiled the kettle until the whole back room smelled of mint and steam. She rubbed the baby's feet and told the mother to keep them wrapped and fed until the fever broke. Word got out before the girl could pay for anything. People began to whisper that Marin was Charity's agent, that she was soft and poor with pity. The preacher's wife sniffed that such generosity might encourage vagrancy. The sheriff's wife muttered that she had been foolish to tie up town blankets. Men at the bar found an audience for their barb jokes. "Marin, don't forget to keep your apron on tight. Folding someone else's bedclothes might get you in trouble." They laughed loud enough for the girl to hear. The girl lowered her eyes. Her gratitude was swallowed by the saloon's mirth. Marin felt the slap of their speech like cold water. She had been shamed before for smaller things. She had sat under harsher tongues and kept from responding. But that day something in her tightened with a fierce, slow heat. She smoothed the blanket over the baby with hands that had once smoothed the hem of her own husband's coat, and she thought of the letters he never sent. She thought of the night the cold crept into the bed and made her bones ache. She thought of being told that dignity was a thing you could lose like a boot if you weren't careful to keep both straps fastened. Caleb watched all of it, his jaw working unseen. He placed his back against the bar and listened to the way shame circled the room. He had been a man who'd learned to see wrongs that smoothed into acceptable patterns, the kind of injustices that wore dresses and carried polite airs. He could have left it alone. He could have gone to his room and let the town perform its ritual of cutting someone down like grain on the floor. Instead, when the mocking rose to a pitch and the preacher's wife began to deliver a moral lecture about propriety and the sanctity of charity, Caleb climbed off his stool. He strode to the small cluster of the loudest talkers and set his hand flat on the table. The room noticed the sound as much as the movement. His hand was a small earthquake. He did not shout. He spoke low, as if his voice were the basin of water people had been leaning over. "Leave her be," he said. The words were simple and landed with the weight of a stone in a pond. The men went quiet. The sheriff's laugh died. "Mind your tongue, sir," the sheriff said, more out of reflex than conviction. He had been used to men who backed down at the sound of his name. Caleb's gaze was steady. "No," he said, "I won't. You make a mockery of wanting to help somebody and call it propriety. That's no kind of religion. That's a show." His eyes flicked to Marin with something like apology for the fact that people needed him to say what was true. The room was full of faces. Some were surprised. Others were smug. A few were curious at the audacity of a stranger telling them how to behave in their own hall. But their laughter had no footing now. Shame is a thing that requires company. Marin had not lifted her head. She kept the blanket tucked close, and her chin was high. The warmth around her eyes was a kind of glow that had nothing to do with the lamplight. She had done the right thing, and that was sometimes all that mattered. The town's mockery had been less about whether the blanket was deserved and more about the pleasure they took in flattening someone. Men who never forgave a wrong they imagined found small joys in the act of pointing. The traveler mother left the saloon with her baby wrapped and babbling at the heat like it had been born to it. She left a coin and a look that said more than the coin could cover. People watched her go. There was an awkward silence that felt almost new. For a few days, talk about Marin softened. Not everyone changed their tune, but some remembered that a woman with steady hands was worth more than their trite amusement. Caleb began to spend his evenings outside Marin's view more and more. He left his boots by the door, and he dropped sacks where she might need them. When he walked past, he would nod like a man who had found a kind of compass point in a strange place. She found, in the weeks after, that there were moments when she did not feel alone even when she was alone. That new loneliness was a useful thing, less like a lead weight and more like space. The snow came in thin flakes at first, like thrown flour. The town wrapped itself tighter. Curtains drew closer to windows, and people kept their doors shut to the wind. Winter makes small things louder. The creak of a floorboard at night, the whinny of a horse in the distance, a kettle hissing on the stove. Each sound became the measure of a day. Marin's hands grew busier. The stove became a teacher. There are lessons in reheating the same coffee day after day until it tastes like memory. There are prayers said in the rhythm of stirring stew. Then the public humiliation came that would change things more loudly. It began when a landowner's son, Jack Halloway, decided he had the right to make a display of power. He was a man who never learned to speak soft to anyone whose life did not put coin in his father's pocket. He had been angered by small slights, something Marin had done when she refused to bend her head in the way his father preferred, perhaps because she didn't know the right things to say. His anger was a thing that liked to be spoken to the room. He chose to humiliate her the way bullies choose a schoolyard. He rode into the saloon with friends and proclaimed, loud enough for the bar to hear, that he had found out where Marin's husband had gone. He said it with the certainty of someone who had read the wrong line and declared it gospel. "He ran off with a widow twice his age," he announced, slapping his palm on the bar in a gesture of possessive triumph. "Left her with nothing but a tin box and a sad smile. Fancy that. It's a pattern, I'd say. Women like that take your coin and your name." The bar fell into a momentary hush because cruelty takes your breath sometimes. The sheriff's face reddened, not in shame but in fright. The preacher's wife looked like a woman who had swallowed a bitter root. Marin felt the world tilt. Rumors are like dry grass. A single spark and they leapt. She had hidden the truth in her tin box and in her chest. Truths that had been folded like sheets and softened into habit. Her husband had not run off. He had been taken by fever 2 years before, and the town's gossip had filled in the blanks with a story that suited them. Marin did not shout. She did not make a scene. She took the insult like a hand taking a coin and set it in the register. But inside, the cold was a different animal. It crawled over her skin and rested on her bones. She wanted to explain, to hold up the tarnished letters, to show the grave markers of a truth that would silence them. But these were people who preferred stories to facts. They would say she was trying to buy sympathy. She did the only thing she had ever known. She kept working. She gathered plates. She poured coffee. She mended tears in aprons. The work was a kind of prayer. Men at the bar watched her with the easy satisfaction of a job done well. Then the unthinkable happened. Jack Holloway's friend, a man named Carter, reached across the table and, with the kind of anger that needs an outlet, grabbed Marin's arm. The saloon light caught on his ring like a judge's gavel. He had no right to touch her. His fingers were like accusations. Marin's arm went numb with the cold of fear. Around them, talk fell away like leaves in a storm. People liked to think they were better than the things that happened in their rooms, but they were also miles away when someone needed them to act. The man's grip tightened as if to make the point more evident. He leaned in to the sound of it, to the satisfaction of taking a person's space and making an example. She did not plead. She held herself like one who had practiced for such occasions and found that the practice mattered. The world taught her to be expected to take pain and move on. That lesson had a quiet cruelty. But Caleb's hand in the doorway stopped such lessons from finishing. He rose from his stool and walked over with the patient, precise motion of a man who had measured direction from the heart. He did not shout. He did not slap the man's hand. He put his hand under Carter's wrist at the same time the man realized he had overstepped. "Take your hand off her," Caleb said. The words were still and cold as winter. There was a pause, a shiver. Then Carter pulled back like a man who had touched a hot plate and had the reflex to remove his hand before the burn took hold. The room seemed to hold its breath. No one had expected a stranger to break the rules of their cruelty with the sort of quiet authority that did not need registration. "You think you're the Board of Justice?" The sheriff barked, trying to make noise. He had never cared for quarrels he could not lead. Caleb's voice was low. "No. I think there's a right way to treat a person. Nobody made you the keeper of shame." He stepped between Marin and the man, his shoulders broad and unassuming. His fingers brushed Marin's arm, brief, a question. She did not look away. She looked at him as if to gauge the true cost of what he had done. Huffing and muttering, Carter and his friends slunk away, carrying their pride like a burden. The room regained something like normal, but the shape of what had happened stayed in the air, a lesson drawn in charcoal on a wall no one could unsee. That night, the saloon shut its doors and the town retreated to its hearths. Marin sat at a small wooden table near the back, and the lamplight gilded her profile. Caleb came in later, boots impressing on the dust. He left his coat by the curtain and sat opposite her without asking, because sometimes asking is an extra weight people do not need. He had a blanket draped over his knees that matched the worn edges of her own. Their conversation was not a thing that began with fireworks. Instead, it started like embers, red with the possibility of a slow burn. He said nothing for a long time. He poured coffee into 2 tin mugs with hands that were gentle as prayer. "You do a lot for people," he said at last. "Why do you keep doing it?" Marin's fingers closed around the mug and her knuckles were pale. She looked at him, and for once they spoke without the town as mediator. "Because somebody has to," she said. Her voice was soft but not brittle. "Because when someone needs help, the work doesn't wait on whether it's deserved. It waits on whether someone will show up." He listened like a man taking notes in a ledger that wasn't his. "It's a harsh town," he observed. "It makes small cruelties sound like good advice." He glanced at the door, as if gauging the distance between the saloon and the cold. She set her mug down. The tin made a small ring, like a bell summoning attention. She thought of the times she had sat in front of the stove, stirring until the spoon felt like an extension of her will. She thought of the way her hands had learned the geography of hardship. "I was given a blanket once," she said, looking down into the worn grain of the table. "An old woman gave it to me when I had no place left to put warm. I took it like someone handing me a lifeline." Her voice tightened like a seam. "They called it charity. People watched like it was a spectacle. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded scrap of paper. He did not offer it to her right away. He set it on the table and slid it the smallest of ways until it rested in front of her. On it, in a hurried hand, was a name and a place. A small note like one you might tuck into a Bible when you wanted to remember where you'd slept that night. There was no flourish to it. The paper had been folded and creased. It was not much. "I had a coat once like that," he said. "Not much to offer in a town that values coin. But I know what it is to have a thing that reminds you somebody saw you." Marin looked at the paper and at him. There was a softness dawning there that began as small as a creek and promised to become a river. "Why did you stay?" she asked. Caleb's jaw tightened. The answer gathered like a story people tell themselves to stand upright. "I got off the trail because some things in my past needed answering to," he said. He paused. "I'm not the man I could have been. I've done things that deserve the rope, maybe, but I can still stand when I see someone getting cut down." She noticed how his fingers found the edge of his mug and curled into it, like a man counting the corners of a map. "You're good at standing up," she said without bitterness. She didn't mean it as a compliment to soften his action. She meant it as an observation, one human being seeing the truth of another. They did not kiss that night. They did not speak of future houses or remarriage or a bed warmed by another breathing being. Theirs was a conversation made of small affirmations. A nod, a shared look, the exchange of two things that once felt private: the blanket, the folded scrap of paper. The saloon's lamplight made a chapel out of their corner. Outside, the wind tapped the glass and the snow kept falling. They sat in companionable silence that was warm as a hearth. In the following days, the town took notice, first with curiosity, then with suspicion. People are small animals when it comes to change. They sniff around what they cannot understand. Rumors are opportunistic things that will always find a place to roost. The preacher's wife decided that any man who sat with a woman single such as Marin was a man with ill intent. She began to weave sermons that weighed heavy on virtue and propriety, and a few folks took comfort in the cadence of moral outrage. Caleb continued to do what he did best: stand beside what he thought right. He did not parade himself as savior. He did not demand gratitude. He simply offered the solidity of his presence. When a child fell from a fence, he was there to lift her up. When a widow needed a new hinge at her gate, he stayed long enough to set it right. People began to notice a pattern. When the town wanted to see a good deed, it tended to ignore the quiet ones. Marin grew to rely on the way his presence made the room feel less like an arena. She began to look for him when she rose in the mornings, and if he was not there she would for a moment feel the lack like the absence of a lantern. She was careful because she had lived long enough to know how fragile public opinion was. She had learned that a single day could make you a hero and the next a pariah. She measured her steps and kept them even. One evening, when the town had drunk its fill of moralities and the stars were like the teeth of a comb against the dark, they sat on the porch of the saloon, wrapped in blankets and listening to the wind through cracked windows. Caleb had pulled his blanket to cover both their knees, and the steam rose from their mugs like threads of old prayers. He watched the line of the horizon where the land met the night and said, "You know, I buried a man once." She looked at him with a sideways tilt, a questioning that asked nothing of him. She felt the creak of the porch boards under her boots. "Who?" "Me in a way," he said. He ran his thumb along the rim of his mug as if it were a compass. "I had a life that owed me to no one. I was an orphan in the way of men who were taught a gun remembers them better than a smile does. I have done things." He let the sentence hang, not in confession so much as in recognition, like two people naming the same weather. She was quiet. She had no desire to pry into the things that men guarded in their ribs. She had learned that the past is a private country with its own borders. But she wanted him to know that she saw him like she wanted to be seen in return. "We're all buried in some way," she said. "Some of us have fewer stones to mark the places." He blinked slowly. "It's a strange town," he said, "full of folks who like to say they're charitable and then measure the worth of the ones they help." He smiled with a kind of wry affection for a world that was often hard. "I don't have a lot, But I have enough to keep you from being mocked while you do the right thing. She looked at the way his coat hung on his shoulders. He had the look of someone who had held sorrow like a warm cup for a very long time, and one who had learned to drink it quietly. She felt something loosen inside of her that had been coiled by years of vigilance. The loosened thing was a cautious hope. Then came the day the ground turned to a white sea and the town learned just how thin its pretense of care could be. A blizzard came quicker than anyone in the town expected. It moved like a wall, covering fences and swallowing tracks until the prairie felt like a closed lid. The wind took voices and the world shrank to the size of a room. People were needed more than ever. For firewood, for food, for a companion to sit with and keep the cold from entering the lungs. There was a knock on the saloon's back door that sounded like a hollow in the ice. It was Norton Bryce, a man who ran the livery and who had once laughed outright at Marin's kindness. He came in with snow like a halo and mentioned to no one that his barn had been struck like a struck bell. His voice was thin with worry. He needed help carrying a broken stallion to shelter. The storm could kill a horse just as easily as any sickness if it had a mind to. He was a landowner and had the right to be proud. But his pride had been couched in necessity now. Marin did not hesitate. She and a few others wrapped themselves in heavy coats and went out into the wind. The world had closed to a line only a few feet wide. The horses were terrified, steaming and straining at their halters. Marin took hold of a stallion's bridle with hands that had handled fear before and spoke to it in a way that calmed the creature. The work was brutal in the cold. The muscles were raw and the ground slick. They bundled the animal in blankets and made a path back to the stable. The work took hours, and when they finished, they were wet to the bone and exhausted to the marrow. That night the town gathered to count its small mercies. The saloon became a place of refuge. People brought stew and shared it. The preacher's wife served bowls she had prepared herself, and for a moment there was an ease to the way hands passed platters. The air was thick with steam and the smell of cooked meat, and for a while the town seemed like a single crowded chest. But great storms have a way of showing people, and their smaller selves, for who they are. Norton Bryce, warmed by his gratitude, decided to make a toast. He raised his mug and told of how Marin had saved his prized horse and how she was a saint for it. The saloon clapped politely. Marin's face flushed a private rose. She stepped back as if to let the claim sit where it belonged. That's when Jack Halloway rose as if he had done no wrong, and the old pattern began again. "You've made her a hero now, have you?" Jack scoffed. "Make no mistake. She runs in with the band and comes out with glory. But it doesn't change what she's done." He gestured with the hand the town knew as a hand that had been given things and expected things in return. "Let's not forget what's been done." The room shifted. The preacher's wife sked, and the sheriff looked at his shoes. This was the town's game. Praise with one hand, pull with the other. But the storm had left tracks of kindness that were not easily erased. Salt of the earth, as Marin did, is hard to hide. "You've said too much," Caleb said before anyone noticed. He was quiet, but he was like a foundation. He stood up, and when he did, the room went still. "Put your tongue back in your mouth, Jack. You'll find nobody here owes you a story to tell." His voice did not thunder. It carried the patient force of a bell that rings long after everyone has left. "You're the one who ought to mind his tongue," Jack replied, leaning on the counter. "A man who picks up the cause of every woman who's been slighted." "What's your angle?" Caleb's jaw hardened. "I'm not running an angle. I'm doing what's right." He said it like a man who had been practiced at the truth until it became the easiest thing to give. There was a tug-of-war in the room between the small voices of reason and the old cruelty. People took sides as if it were a parlor game. Some applauded when Caleb spoke. Others liked the drama of a downfall. Marin watched it all with the way of someone who had learned not to take public opinion for an anchor. She saw how the snow had made good deeds brighter and pettiness more obvious. The moment that changed everything was not loud. It came like snowflakes that stopped time. A shout rose from the doorway. Someone had seen a man on the prairie, stumbling, half buried in snow. He had been caught with his horse thrown and his wagon overturned. He had been lucky to be alive. People rushed out, leaving the room to the soft echo of the kettle. They worked like a single body to bring the man in. He had frost on his eyelashes and the color of a person who had seen much wind. They wrapped him in blankets and set him near the stove. His name was Tom Kaplan, a farmer from 3 miles out. He had been traveling to fetch seed and been caught by the storm. He was grateful in a way that makes people say prayers aloud. He did not have much, but what he had was the kind of gratitude that lingers in a town like St. He told his story in short pieces and the room listened. When it came time to rest, the farmer's wife, an exhausted woman with cheeks like folded bread, reached out to pin a blanket more tightly to Tom's shoulders. Her hands were raw but gentle. Marin watched her, and something in her loosened. Joy not yet claimed, but recognized. It was a small, human thing. Outside, the wind had wrapped the town in a quiet that almost vibrated. There was a sense that the world had been tested and held. Inside, people shuffled and found their way to their beds. Marin and Caleb lingered at the table, the steam from their mugs curling into shapes like prayers. They spoke of small things, of how to mend a broken harness, of where the best fur for sealing a door could be had. Their conversation folded around them like a blanket. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. It was not an earthquake. It was the slow working of water through soil, small, insistent, remaking the shape of things. The town, which had been so fond of its judgments, found itself less able to dress cruelty as righteousness. People began to step back from the edge of mockery when they saw Marin's face in the courage of a woman who had always ministered to others. They had been used to the sight of her as an easy target. Now she was something else, proof that the town had been blind. Caleb's watching turned into an active presence. He mended fences for men who could no longer be bothered. He moved a stubborn gate that had long been left to rot. But most of all, he made himself a place beside Marin, not as a savior but as company. She found herself telling him things she had told no one. Sweet, small things like the name of the horse her husband had once favored, the way the windows in their home used to catch the afternoon light. She told of the tin box and the letters inside, and of nights when music drifted in dreams and left her with an ache shaped like memory. He told her in return in slices of his past. He had been an outlaw for a time, he said, not with swagger but with the sort of flat-toned admission that comes from someone who has done wrong and is tired of defending it. He had ridden with men whose morals were loose as rope. He had been on the wrong side of some fights. He had seen the way that the trail can make a man think he is exempt from being human. He had left because he'd had enough of being someone's blade, and because some small part of him desired the steady pleasure of being on the right side of things. "I'm no saint," he told her. "I'm a man who likes to make sure people aren't walked over." "You could have stayed on the wrong side," she said. Her fingers toyed with the woven hem of the blanket. "You didn't." He shrugged. "It's simpler to stand up for people I think deserve it than to keep making myself hard." He looked at her as if measuring her for a future that had been born slowly in the space between them. "And you deserve it." There wasn't a grand epiphany. There were moments. There were small hand squeezes. There were mornings when they woke to find a pot of coffee already started, or a horse fed without a word. There were evenings where they washed dishes in companionable silence and found their movements matched. It was slow like glue doing its work, almost unremarkable when you watched it day by day. But when you look back months later, you can see how the lines have been redrawn. Months passed. Snow melted into a stubborn sludge and then to a muddy spring. The town slowly shifted away from its habit of public cruelty. People learned the dangerous pleasure of being kind, that to behave gently in public was something rarer than they had thought. The preacher's wife stopped making pointed remarks in the same breath she offered coffee. Perhaps she had noticed how her words landed. The sheriff smiled less and listened more. None of it was radical, none of it was headline news. It was the slow re-education of daily life. One evening, after a day's work, the two of them walked the small road out of town. The prairie stretched like an open hand and the sky was wide. The sun sat like a coin on the horizon, gilding the fence posts. They came to a farmhouse porch where a man sat whittling. The man was old and kind. He called to them and offered apples he had kept for visitors. They ate them, their fingers sticky with sweetness. The man spoke of his own wife, long gone, and of the simple duty of keeping her memory warm. The conversation settled like a place where two strangers found something they both wanted. Marin told the old man about the letters in the tin box. She said they were all she had left of her husband. The old man listened and then said, "You keep them and you keep him. Don't feel shame for the things that tie you to people you've loved. Folks can be cruel because they're afraid. Don't let their fear shape yours." Caleb watched her take the advice in. She put her hand on his arm, and it was an even pressure, not a claim but an anchor. She looked at him, and for a moment they were both silent, the kind of shared quiet where words would only make the truth clumsier. Then, because life has a sense for timing when no one expects it, Jack Halloway returned to Mr. Bryce's dance. He was not a man who learned much by being told. He found himself setting up a weekend celebration to show off his father's new stallion. The town gathered in feigning support. Some saw the gesture for what it was, a bid for approval. Others went because the chance to watch, to be entertained, was enough. Marin came in because it was her job as much as her heart. She had been working the bar that day, and Caleb had helped with setting chairs out because that was what men who respected others did in theirs. Jack, who had never learned kindness well, saw Marin and decided to throw a last go at her. He strode up and proclaimed loudly to the crowd that her husband had been a thief and that she had been hiding it, and that the town ought to be careful of the company she kept. Cartoons of whispers rose like laughter. The room shifted. People looked at Caleb, expecting him to anchor them as before. He rose and stood in a way that said he would not be the one to feed cruelty. He walked to the middle of the room and, for the first time, his voice was something like an unrolled banner. "You want to throw darts, Jack?" he said. "Here's a dart for you. Have the courage to say what you mean without dragging another person's life through the dirt." He spoke quietly, and his voice had the depth of a canyon. "Marin has worked this town's kindness into the morning and the night. She has saved animals, bandaged people, fixed what others have broken. If you want to insult somebody, do it to someone who deserves it." His eyes held the room like a tide. Jack, who was not used to being stopped, felt something like a stutter in his chest. The man's hands were the sort that rearranged things until they fit his idea. "You're meddling," he said. Caleb shook his head. "No. I'm defending the plain truth. You were always more comfortable shouting than listening." Words were cheap in that room, and sometimes they landed like stones that made no change. But this time, Caleb's defense was a thing people began to consider, as if the town had been given a second set of glasses. The preacher's wife looked away. The sheriff's face was red, and he cleared his throat in a way that made people notice the sound. Marin did not stand. She remained behind the counter with her hands folded like a prayer. Her eyes, when they met Caleb's, were not an invitation or a claim but the small recognition of two people who had walked a difficult road together and were not embarrassed to say so. The room grew still in the way a church does when a sermon hits the part that matters. After that episode, something in the town's rhythm changed once more. It was as if someone had turned up the dial on common decency. Maybe it was Caleb's steady defense. Maybe it was the realization that cruelty is often a habit worn by people who are afraid. Whatever the cause, people thawed. They began to notice her presence as an asset rather than a target. They spoke her name like an offering. Marin, the woman who kept the saloon from closing because she never let it. They were shy and slow about it, but the change was real. From then on, the worst cruelties were quieter. There were still snipes. Human beings will always have a small, sharp tongue somewhere, but they no longer had the weight of the town's approval. Marin found herself walking lighter in the mornings. She found space to breathe when she closed the kitchen door at night. Caleb's presence was a place she returned to, not because she needed saving, but because she had found someone who recognized her. The two of them became like two hearthstones. Friends came to them with broken things and found them fixed. The saloon became a place where work and care were equal measures, where someone's sorrow would be met by the steady rhythm of dishes as much as by consolation. They gave their spare blankets to those in need and sometimes to each other when the rooms grew cold. They walked the roads together. They kept company with the old and laughed with children whose boots were too small. Their afternoons became small rituals. Taking a walk to the river when the weather allowed, or sitting on the porch while the town warmed itself with tales. Then one day, as spring stretched like a hand into summer's pocket and the prairie was green with the first brave weeds, Marin received a letter. It came not like the old letters that spoke of promises unkept, but in a proper envelope, crisp and smelling of ink and respect. The town's mail carrier had delivered it with the kind of deliberation you give to things of importance. She took it to the back room, sat down on the smallest of chairs, and unfolded the page. It was from a man who had once worked for her husband, a man who had known him on the trail. He had found the truth. He had been buried by sickness, not desertion, and he had found a small, honest coin to give back. The letter wasn't much. It said what it needed to, that the story that had been told of her husband had been a lie and that the town's rumor had been wrong. Marin read the letter and then set it on the table and began to laugh. It was not a sound of triumph but of something lighter, relief that could be felt like a physical thing. She had been carrying the weight of shame that was never hers to hold. The town had been wrong. She had been wronged. The letter did not erase the hurt. It did, however, clean her hands of some of the grime that had stuck to her heart for so long. Caleb was with her when she read it. He watched her face and saw the way her shoulders dropped like a sail set free of wind. He reached for her hand, and this time she did not hesitate to clasp his fingers like a mutual remedy. They did not speak for a while. The silence was full of the kind of contentment that people rarely get to taste. A quiet both earned. The town, as towns will, noticed. There were conversations in the grocery store that brought up the letter, and some people apologized. Awkwardly, of course, because apologies in that town had a way of being heavy with formality. But apologies came. They were not gilded. They were simple offerings. Some kissed her cheeks and said, "We were wrong," others mumbled and left quickly, because some people always prefer the comfort of their mistakes. Marin accepted the apologies with the dignity of someone who had learned the value of such things. She did not hold vengeance in her hands. She had seen how necessary mercy was, even when it cost her nothing. The town's new gentleness was not universal, but it was more common than it had been. Caleb stayed for the summer and then for the next. There was a steadiness to their companionship that looked ordinary from a distance and completed on closer inspection. They were not always romantic in the way songs make people out to be. They were human, with small irritations and daily compromises. Sometimes they argued over the placement of a new broom, or whether to mend a fence now or later. They learned each other's habits, like which mug the other preferred and when silence was welcome and when distraction was needed. One night, as the grass bowed under the dusk and the day cooled like a wound stilled, Caleb brought Marin a blanket. Not the patched one she kept by the stove, but a new one, woven with a thought that had taken time to become itself. He put it over her shoulders and did not speak. Instead, he sat beside her and looked at the stars like a man who measured the arc of his life in small constellations. She leaned against him, and the moment was quiet with the sort of truth that does not demand loudness. "Why did you stay?" she asked him, not from need but from curiosity. They had asked the question before, but the answer wanted to be told again in a new way. He sighed, which was the sound he made when the world seemed to be the sum of 1,000 little truths. "Because you are the sort of woman who quietly keeps the world, and because I have things to answer to. I suppose I stayed because being with you gave me a reason not to be what I had been." She laughed softly. It was the sound of a person who had learned the value of mercy. "Don't make me into your reason," she said. "I don't want to be the thing that keeps you from your past." "You won't be," he said. "But maybe you are the thing that will keep me from being a man who forgets how to be gentle. And that's worth its weight in gold." They did not become a spectacle or the sort of couple who shout their love from the roofs. They were a quiet certainty. Folks would see them at the saloon, at the farm, mending what needed mending. They were partners in the sense that partners share a roof and a mind and an inheritance of daily tasks. They had small rituals. A walk by the river once a week, an extra mug of coffee for the widow down the road. They found a rhythm that belonged only to them. Saturday mornings became their time for mending. Sunday afternoons for sitting on the porch and watching the prairie. Spring turned to summer and then to a dry, unremarkable autumn. The town grew used to the new shape of things and found it comfortable. The months balanced like scales. There were, of course, misgivings, people who never adapted to the softening of the town's edges, but they were fewer. The town had learned, painfully and slowly, that the loudest moral voices are not always the truest. One evening, on the cusp of winter, when the air had a taste of the first frost, Caleb did something he had not been good at. He gave Maren a place that belonged to her in a way more than the saloon did. He had been saving money, little coins earned by mending fences, by carrying sacks for men who would not pay, putting them into a tin can and into a drawer. He did not make a big show of it. He kept it hidden because he had been a man who had learned how to give without pomp. He waited until the night when the moon was a silver suggestion in the sky, and then he handed her the key to a house on the edge of town. It was a small house with a porch that creaked and a yard that had been fought over by weeds and daisies. It had a single lean-to, a stove that needed cleaning, and windows that caught the morning like a cup collects dew. "You can make it yours," he told her, his face a mix of pride and the fear that generosity will be refused. "It's yours if you want it, or it's ours, or it's nothing. I only wanted you to have a choice." Maren took the key like a person taking a small son. Her hands were made of the sort of calluses that belong to work and care, and they shook with something like joy. "I didn't know you were a man of such getting," she said, smiling a small and pleased smile. He shrugged like a man used to hiding small victories. "I can be boring when pressed," he said. They fixed the house over the winter. They painted the door and set a plant on the windowsill that was stubborn enough to survive the season. They kept blankets folded in a neat stack and put a small tin on the table with the letters that had once been her anchor. They kept the past safe as a thing learned from, not a chain. They sat in the evenings and shared stories until the sun slid behind the hills and the world turned to the slow heart of the night. One cold night, when frost sprinkled the porch like sugar and the moon lit the prairie in paler colors than Maren had ever seen, they sat close with a blanket thrown over both their knees. The stove popped like an old friend. Outside, the wind walked across the fields and left its marks. The kettle on the stove hissed and then quieted. They had worked their way through the day, the market, the chores, the usual small responsibilities that make up a life, and now they were simply together. Caleb reached across and placed a blanket in her lap. He looked at her, the lines around his eyes deep with the years of storms and kindness. He did not speak immediately. He cupped a mug in both hands, savoring the warmth. The night hummed with small noises. The creak of a floorboard, the distant whinny of a horse, the faint sound of boots on another porch across town. Their world had shrunk to the center of a single room. "You did a brave thing that night," he said suddenly. "Not because you stood up to them, not because you let it bruise you and kept working, but because you kept on with a kind of quiet that the town didn't appreciate. It's harder to be kind when people mock you for it." She looked at him and saw the blade of truth beneath his words. "People who are kind sometimes look foolish," she said, "but they also do work no one notices. And if anyone had the right to be bitter, you might say I do." He smiled at her like a man who'd made a small vow to himself years before. "You've earned the right to more than that." She let herself be quiet and then spoke very softly, like someone confessing to offense. "Sometimes I feel like I live with one foot out the door because I think the town will decide I'm no longer useful. I worry they'll remember me by one small mistake and forget everything else." "You're not going anywhere," he said. His voice was flat with a small certainty. "Not on my watch." She studied his face, the slow lines where experience and mercy had been etched. She folded the blanket around her hands and set her face to the small dignity of the moment. "Don't let me be your burden," she said. "You won't be," he replied, "and neither will you be mine. We'll be two people who make a life because we choose to." They did not promise the moon or recite vows. They exchanged simpler things. A look that said we'll carry the heavy parts together, a hand that said, "I'll stand in the doorway when the town gets cruel again." The night held them like a patient witness. Years loosened their hold on the town and then on the world. Seasons repeated themselves with familiar rhythm. Marin and Caleb's life moved forward in small steps. Saving a calf, harvesting a crop, painting a fence. They were not a dramatic couple but a strong one. Their love was the sort that grows in the space left by doing the small and necessary things. They married in a quiet ceremony at the church when the preacher's wife finally said a kind thing, and the sheriff's nod was something like a benediction. The town came in its modest state, some folks with smiles, others with a different kind of regret. There were no grand parties. Instead, there was a dinner where Marin's stew was served and Caleb sat in a corner and told a story or two about a horse that had once been stubborn but now was tame. They lived in the small house on the edge of town and kept a big garden and a small group of animals. People came to them with what needed mending, and they gave what they could. They were not wealth-rich. They had a life that was full of the kind of contentment that fell from nights spent talking low by amber light. They kept the tin box where the letters were and sometimes read them aloud like a ritual. They both cherished the blanket that had been passed down to Marin, and it lived on their bed like a knot that tied past to future. As the years rolled on, the town changed further. New businesses arrived, and young people left for the cities, where the idea of kindness was sometimes traded for speed. The old men who had once mocked took their place on benches and watched the young mess with their attempts at boldness. The preacher's wife died with a letter in her pocket that said she forgave young men who tried to change. The sheriff got a new deputy who didn't need approval to be fair. The saloon stayed because places that house stories always find a way. The people remembered Marin's name less as a label and more as a memory of someone whose quiet had been louder than the town's cruelty. One winter night, as the town had become a little softer, a young woman came to the saloon with a child on her hip. She was the kind of girl who had the world in her teeth, and the child had the cheeky curiosity of someone who would not be kept small. She had heard about Marin and how a woman once took a blanket and gave it like a promise. She had heard the story of how two quiet people held a town's behavior like a mirror and reflected the better part back. Marin took the young woman beyond the bar and listened to her story. Her eyes were kind and she offered a blanket and some food without making the girl explain or prove. It was the simple handing of a kindness now steeped in years of practice. When people came who needed help, she gave it as if it were paying forward a debt that had been settled when others could not. Caleb sat in the doorway that night, watching her as she wrapped the child in a blanket like a priest wrapping a reliquary. His hands were not the hands of a boy. They were wide and capable and softened by a life of mercy. He watched her and felt the steady rightness of everything that had happened between them. He had told her once, years before, "Don't thank me for the blanket. Thank me for staying." It had been the line a man says when he cannot say everything else. He said it because he had learned how essential it is to be a witness, and because he had discovered that the act of staying was its own kind of grace. She had laughed then, not because the line was funny but because it made the truth something to set in a place and keep. She had told him she did not want to be anyone's cause. He had answered that she never had been. She had been a companion, a comrade in the slow war against the town's cruelties. She had the dignity to accept his staying as a gift and not as a claim on her soul. When they grew old enough to be remembered as the kind of people who had always been part of the town, their lives were less about drama and more about the quiet accumulation of good deeds. Their daughter, born to them like a small miracle one summer that had no shortage of quiet, ran around the porch with sticky hands and helped her mother with the stew. She grew into a woman who had none of the need to perform kindness in order to be seen. She worked with hands that had been raised on a table where meals were shared without a ledger. She carried the family's tenderness into new places and, in time, became the kind of person who told stories to the young who would listen. One night, as the years leaned forward and the town had become gentler in its own quiet way, an old man came to their door with a small parcel. He had been the one who had once been cruel, turned soft by time. He placed the parcel in Marin's hands and said, with an awkwardness that comes from decades of learning, "I thought of you sometimes. I wanted to give back. It was a small mending kit. Needles, thread, small things you take to fix the world. Marin accepted it with a nod and with the generosity that had taken her years to temper. Patience, not all-embracing. She did not make him say sorry. Sometimes a man's change is enough. He left a more learned man than he had been when he entered the room. They grew old like two comfortable chairs that have been well sat, not swept clean for the sake of appearances but worn at the right places. They had their quiet hours and their rough moments. They sometimes argued about trivialities, the right way to lay a dishcloth or the best direction to plant the beans. Then resumed their small life. They took joy in the simplicity of their routines. A trip to market where she chose the best eggs, a quiet drink after a hard day, a chair that was always kept warm. Their end did not come with a brass band or a grand revelation. It came like a sunset and then like a quiet night. For a long time they had each other. When Caleb passed first, it was in the bed in the small house with her fingers in his and the blanket tucked around them. He had kept his word in the way a man keeps a promise sealed not in gold but in presence. Marin sat with him until the room stopped being noisy and only the soft sounds remained. She mourned him like a storm that will not stop. The town noticed. People came and left casseroles and offered eyes that said they understood. The old ones remembered how he had defended her, and the young ones had never known the town without the gentler shape he had helped it take. She spent her days in a way that honored the quiet life they had built. Making bread, fixing a fence, reading letters in the tin box. She kept the new blanket, draped on the back of her chair. Years later, when she died, it was with the comfort that comes from a life that was full of small acts rather than a single grand event. She passed with the names of those she loved on her lips and the quiet conviction that staying had been the right thing. The town gathered to remember her. They spoke her name not as a remark but as a blessing. People who had once been cruel offered simple tributes. Flowers, a story about her kindness, the gift of something she had once taught them. They had learned to call her by her name, to say Marin as if it mattered. At the funeral, someone read the letter from the man who had written of her husband's truth. It was a small sound that made the church fill with the kind of quiet that has been earned. Someone else told the story of the night when Caleb had stood up in the saloon. The preacher spoke about mercy, about how courage comes in many forms, and he did not sound like a man writing a sermon for his own benefit. The old man who had once been cruel stood at the back and wore his shame like something learned, and the town made offerings like children giving up a toy to show they had grown. After the funeral, people gathered at the saloon and told stories. A child who had been wrapped in a blanket Marin had given decades before sat at the table and ate a piece of pie. There was a quiet in the town that felt like the rightness of a job finished. And as all good stories must give a final shape to their rest, the narrator speaks plainly. If her story hit you hard, if you saw yourself in her quiet burdens or in her steady hands, remember this. Some roots grow in silence. Some people do the right thing without a brass band. They are the ones who keep towns together with the geometry of bread and blankets and the simple refusal to give in to cruelty. They called her just the help for many years. They learned, slowly, that a blanket is less about charity and more about attention. They learned to respect someone who stayed. Caleb's words, a man who had been a stranger and then a companion, had been truthful. Don't thank me for the blanket. Thank me for staying. It was the sort of line that tells a person everything they need to know about what it takes to make a life. Marin left a mattress that smelled faintly of dove-gray nights and a box of letters that spoke of a past reclaimed from rumor. She left a town that had been softened by small acts and that now had a new rhythm to its days. People said her name with an affection they had not felt before, and the young woman she had once helped took up a small kind of stewardship. She continued Marin's work not as a duty but as a chosen life, teaching her children what a quiet, dignified kindness looked like. When the last piece of the board creaked on the saloon steps, when the kettle let off its last hiss, and when the stars came out to steady themselves above the prairie, the town remembered how it had been changed by a woman who would not stop giving and by a man who would not stop standing. The memory of them became a sort of weather for the town, the kind that told people how to speak to each other in winter and how to sit quietly beside another in the night. So, if you ever find yourself passing through a dusty place where people are quick with their judgments, remember that sometimes the truest courage is the quietest. Remember that there are people who will give you a blanket and there are people who will stay to make sure you can keep it. And that's how a whisper changed a town.